Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akeridoluale. The headlines. EU Council President calls for more pressure on Russia to end the war in Ukraine at the G20 summit. US President Joe Biden envisions Ukraine conflict slowing down during the winter. And United Nations General Assembly calls for Russia to make reparations in Ukraine. We'll begin with a breaking story coming out of the G20 meeting in Indonesia, where United Kingdom Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has criticized Russia's war in Ukraine. Mr. Sunak criticized the Putin regime, saying it had stifled domestic dissent and fabricated a veneer of validity only through violence. Mr. Sunak adds that China posed a systemic challenge to the United Kingdom, but stopped short of calling it a national security threat. Moving on, the European Council President, Charles Michel, called for more to be done to convince all the partners of the group of G20 to put more pressure on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, and criticized Moscow for triggering a global energy and food crisis with a, quote, unprovoked war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine had triggered calls by some Western leaders for a boycott of the summit and for the withdrawal of Russian President Vladimir Putin's invitation. But G20 host Indonesia, however, resisted doing so, refusing to withdraw Mr. Putin's invitation and also rejecting what Indonesian sources say had been pressure from G7 nations to condemn Russia at the summit this week.
I'm absolutely convinced that we should try to use the meeting today and tomorrow, but also the informal contacts that we'll have in the margin of this G20 meeting in order to try to convince all the partners of the G20 to put more pressure on Russia. Because the UN Charter, the principles of sovereignty, the idea that it's not acceptable to try to change borders by force, internationally recognized borders should be shared by everyone around the table. And that's why I sincerely hope that it will be possible over the meetings that we'll have today and tomorrow to put pressure and to convince that the UN Charter must be respected by all the G20 partners. Yeah, this is extremely important, that initiative I mentioned. And the single best way to end the acute crisis in food and energy is for Russia to end this senseless war and to respect the UN Charter with all the countries across the world in order to explain why we are absolutely convinced that this war launched by Russia is extremely serious first for the Ukrainians, extremely serious for the European continent, but it is more than that, because this is a member of the Security Council. In principle, the members, the permanent members of the Security Council, they should have a special responsibility to protect and to defend the UN Charter, and this, with this act by Russia, the opposite.
U.S. President Joe Biden believes the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine is expected to slow down in winter. He made the remarks during a press conference after his meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Indonesia. Asked how the capture of the city of Kherson by Kiev's forces after the Russian withdrawal might affect the conflict and whether it would signal a turning point in the hostilities, Mr. Biden hailed the development as a significant victory for Ukraine. He says, quote, I've been very clear that we're going to continue to provide the capability for the Ukrainian people to defend themselves, and we're not going to engage in any negotiations. Mr. Biden adds that there's nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, indicating that any negotiations with Moscow was a decision for Ukraine to make. The United States expects Ukrainian conflict to stall during the winter, and at the same time, Mr. Biden says the U.S. expected the conflict to slow down a bit in the coming season due to the inability to move as easily around the country. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has told world leaders at the G20 summit that Russia's war must end now. He also pleaded for an extension of a significant grain export deal due to expire soon. Mr. Zelensky presented a 10-point peace plan to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a video speech to G20 leaders. According to a transcript shared by the Embassy of Ukraine in Indonesia, the steps include a path to nuclear safety, food security, a special tribunal for alleged Russian war crimes, and a final peace treaty with Moscow. He also urged G20 leaders to use all their power to make Russia abandon nuclear threats and implement a price cap on energy imported from Moscow. Mr. Zelensky also called on Russia to stop bombing Ukraine's energy infrastructure as winter approaches. He says, quote, "Let Russia prove by its rejection of terror that it is really interested in the restoration of peace." Moscow has been isolated at this year's G20 summit as multiple Western leaders vowed not to have any contact with its foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who is in attendance on behalf of the Kremlin. In the meantime, Mr. Zelensky has also welcomed the statements from the United States and China from the Group of 20 meeting on the inadmissibility of threats to use nuclear weapons. The United Nations General Assembly had called for Russia to be held accountable for its conduct in Ukraine, voting to approve a resolution recognizing that Russia must be responsible for making reparations to that country. The resolution, supported by 94 of the Assembly's 193 members, said Russia, which invaded its neighbor in February of 2022, quote, "must bear the legal consequences of all of its internationally wrongful acts, including making reparations for the injury, including any damage caused by such acts." Let's talk now to Mr. Chukwuemeka Eze, former lecturer on diplomatic and consular relations at the Faculty of Law at Nassau State University in Kefi. He joins us virtually from there. Good morning to you, Mr. Eze. Thank you for your time.
Good morning. Thank you.
Finally, the Chinese and the Americans have sat down, but it doesn't seem as if that meeting has resolved in any way anything. Both leaders in the readouts after the meeting seem to have stuck to their positions. The Americans have stuck to the fact that they will come to the aid of Taiwan if it is attacked by China. And China has said that Taiwan's reunification with the mainland remains at the core of the core interests of China, and that they are not willing to countenance any kind of negotiation, that it's a red line that no one must cross. So the meeting was a failure.
Yes, the meeting was a failure, but it gives a glimmer of hope that dialogue is going on. They'll meet somewhere. After all diplomacy, all wars will end on the table. So I think it's good that they met and that they've taken definite and definitive positions on the Taiwan question. But I see China not giving up on Taiwan. China is not known to have given away territory over the century, voluntarily. And having taken this position, I think nothing will change other than the present standoff between China and United States for the next 2 decades to come.
Many people who were watching for this meeting had said, look, in human relations, there's nothing like sitting down face to face. Virtual meetings, telephone calls are not quite the same thing as when you are seated face to face with the person you're supposed to be talking to, which was why so much store was placed on this meeting, being the first following the two leaders' emergence onto the world stage as probably numbers one in their respective spheres. I'm wondering, in terms of the war in Ukraine, again, there was no agreement. China did not promise to abide by any of the sanctions placed on Russia by the West, and the United States failed to persuade China to stop any kind of support to Russia. So again, were we expecting too much, perhaps?
I think we were expecting too much, because in geopolitical alliance, China goes with Russia almost at all times. If you check with respect to the votes at the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, you will discover that China has always voted alongside Russia. The worst China can do is to abstain. So in geopolitical alliance, whether militarily or otherwise, except for economic purposes, that's when you see China tilting towards sometimes the United States of America. Otherwise, China tilts towards Russia on one hand, and on the other hand towards North Korea. You remember the 1950 to 1953 Korean War. China fought on the side of North Korea and ensured that the war did not end in favor of the United States and South Korea. So it is not surprising for students of international law and analysts to come to a conclusion that one wouldn't have expected China to toe the line of the United States and stop supplying weapons and allow Russia to be defeated so that if you lose one of its geopolitical partners, I don't think China will allow that.
There is something of a conundrum, or if you like, a paradox in all of this, because in the course of this conflict in Ukraine, a law was passed forbidding negotiations with Vladimir Putin and Russia. But as you said at the beginning of this discussion, everything must eventually end on the negotiation table. So how is that not a shot in the foot if you immediately preclude any kind of negotiations? Volodymyr Zelensky, that's the president of Ukraine, has come up with a peace plan now, a 10-point peace plan. But if they're not going to talk to the Russians, how are we going to get any traction on this kind of peace plan? And all the other parties to the conflict, the U.S. in particular, have said, look, this is a decision for Ukraine. Is that really true? I mean, going by what you know about this situation.
If you watch a boxing match, the two boxers will be boasting before the match will take off. This one will say, I will knock you out in the first round. The other one will say, I will knock you out in the third round. But at the end of the day, during the pugilist, you will come to understand who will knock the other one out. So the law made by Ukraine is for Ukrainians. It does not have international flavor and cannot bind other countries. So Zelensky was speaking to Ukrainians, and in international relations, it is a case of never say that. So that law will not work. And by the American President Biden saying that Ukraine will be on the table, I understand what it means, because you recall that there have been negotiations in the past where guarantors of Ukraine entered into agreements on behalf of Ukraine, and Ukraine did not play a key part. In this one, America is saying that Ukraine will be on the table, so Russia will not say, okay, if it is just America and Britain that signs, I'll be okay. No. Ukraine will be on the table. Ukraine will present its terms. And as we speak today, they are already termed that Russia should evacuate Ukraine. They should give security guarantees. And Russia should no longer take over territories within Ukraine. And basically, as we speak now, I don't think Russia will completely evacuate Ukraine. Definitely Crimea, Russia will not be ready to give it up. So if we get to a point that there will be compromise, it is usual in diplomacy, and this will come to pass.
I want to leverage on your expertise in diplomatic and consular relations at this point. Well, perhaps instead of the U.S. and China just sitting down one-on-one, that is Presidents Biden and President Xi, particularly as it relates to the war in Ukraine, but they should have brought in the country which has been most successful in the negotiations concerning this war, which was Turkey. That Turkey should also have been on the table to probably share with them some of the knowledge that it gleaned from its success, particularly with reference to the grain initiative. Do you think with hindsight, I mean, the meeting has taken place, but do you think with hindsight, maybe another more neutral arbiter who could act as probably the cooling temper third party should have been in the room when these two leaders met for the first time?
As important as Turkey is, it is not a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So bilateral diplomatic moves may not necessarily bring all the parties at the first instance. So China meeting US, some of the issues they discussed, like that of Taiwan, did not need Turkey to be in that meeting. So that bilateral diplomatic meeting was necessary. It will get to a point, all of them know what Turkey is doing, and their diplomatic missions actually informing them what Turkey is doing. Even Turkey and the United States are members of NATO. So there is no way Turkey will not be briefing NATO. So they know what Turkey is doing. When it gets to involving Turkey, I think they will do. They will do. But some of the issues they discussed did not require Turkey to be in them.
Do you think that, as President Biden said, the conflict is going to slow down anyway because of the weather in Ukraine? The Russians and the Ukrainians and indeed all the other support forces on either side will not find it easy to move around the country. So that will bring down the tempo or the momentum of the conflict. And that may give room for negotiations to take place. I mean, if the conflict is not intense, then attention may then refocus on negotiations. Have you looked at that possibility, and how viable is it?
I've looked at that possibility, and I think it's partly true. If Russia is bombing with its cruise missiles from the sea, from perhaps from Crimea, definitely the winter will not disturb if these ships from sending missiles to Ukraine. But if they depend on artillery, the use of artillery, the armored, the infantry, that is, to that extent it is true, because there will be foot on the ground and there will be need to be near to the point of action. But if you are coming from a very, very distant place, I mean, winter will not stop cruise missiles from being sent forth from the sea. So I think that's why I said it's partly true. When it comes to putting foot on the ground or bombing from near places that are closed, the winter, definitely weather, climate plays a role in warfare. So that cannot be dismissed. I agree substantially with Putin, but it depends on what Russia decides to do. If they decide to bomb from far, definitely it's not going to. If they use their rockets from far, they can bomb from Crimea, they can bomb from Donetsk, they can bomb from Luhansk, they can bomb from many points, even the Black Sea. So I think substantially true, but I don't see it as 100% being the case.
The grain reserve or sea grain deal initiative that was negotiated by the Turks along with the United Nations is due to expire on November the 19th. That's just in a couple of days. That deal has seen Ukraine be able to export grain to badly needed areas where you have farming like Ethiopia, Yemen, and Somalia, just to mention a few, which are well known. But it doesn't seem as if there's any sense of urgency about renewing it. The Russians have indicated they have some demands. The Ukrainians want it renewed, but the people who negotiated it in the first place seem to now be preoccupied with other things. What are the chances that this deal will be renewed on November 19?
It all depends on Russia. Russia holds the ace. If they don't want to renew it, then it will not be renewed. It takes two to tango. But being preoccupied, nations can never be preoccupied solely with certain areas of life. Well, yes, correctly, Turkey has just been, there has been terrorist activity in Turkey. There is bombing. There was bombing last week in Turkey, and Turkey is facing that. But the whole foreign ministry of Turkey cannot face one thing. So I think there will be moves to renew it, but I don't know the way the mind of Russia is working. Since its evacuation from Kherson, having left Kherson and planning a relaunch of attack, nobody knows whether it will be one of the weapons, because in war, fair is foul and foul is fair. So you never know whether hunger or reduction of income of Ukraine or imports or exports, to what extent they will consider that those economic activities as going to impact on their victory. So nobody really knows the way the Russian mind is working now. But if it is not renewed, many countries in Africa will suffer. So I think Russia may, at the end of the day, because of African countries, and the previous visit of Macky Sall, the African Union chairman, decide to allow, perhaps it will regulate the quantity that will be exported. But I don't think, in my mind, even though we don't know the way the Russian mind is working, in my mind, I think Russia will, at the end of the day, still allow renewal. But whether it will be immediate, I don't know. I don't really.
Diplomatic and consular relations law expert Chukwemeka Eze, thank you for your time and for your perspective on the program this morning.
Thank you very much, Akredula.
Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back to the program. Let's cross over now to Poland, where we can talk to Dr. Michał Maciejacek, a family medicine specialist at the Polish Mothers Hospital. Thank you for your time, Doc. Nice to see you once again. Quite a while.
Nice to see you too. Nice to see you too. It took us a while to come back to you, yeah.
Indeed. In the interim, when last I spoke to you, I remember that you said that the situation at that time was easing off in terms of the number of Ukrainians who were crossing over into Poland, but that those who crossed over, their medical position in many instances was quite difficult. Is that still the situation today?
Yeah, the situation tends to be stable right now. So we have the number that we had, but we still are on a very big pressure because of the number of the patients that are coming to the clinics. But again, the situation tends to be stable, but the winter is coming, and we are a bit afraid of what will happen in Ukraine, because they have a lot of problems with energy, a lot of problems with heating. So there is a chance that quite a lot of people will try to cross to Poland because of the situation with the weather as well.
That brings, of course, to mind the fact that in all of this kind of conflict situations, as you and I have discussed in the past, mothers and children are particularly vulnerable. The children, because their immunity systems are either still developing or in some instances not yet developed, and therefore they're susceptible to changes in the situation that they find themselves, such as this. And then in the case of the mothers, it's a similar situation, except that their own ailments may be different. So that brings me to the issue of facilities and funding. I remember when I spoke to you last, you talked about the fact that in spite of quite a number of promises made when Poland accepted to accommodate these refugees from Ukraine, not much had been given in that regard. Is that situation better now? Do you have more facilities, more medications to handle what you've just said?
Yeah, we don't have a problem with medications at that point. With facilities, probably it could have been better, and definitely it could have been better with the number of doctors, nurses, and all the staff that we need. the situation of founding, it's part of the problem that it's quite a lot of arms and that kind of stuff sent to Ukraine, but not enough, in my opinion, not enough medicines, not enough help from the point of view of sickness and problems after fights. You said that mainly the problem is on women and children, and that's true because most of the refugees that came to Poland are women and children, which is pretty much typical in the situation of war like we have now, because all who can are fighting for freedom, basically. Luckily, with some successes by now, but still we are, again, I will say that we are on a big pressure now, and for now, the season for flu and other upper respiratory system diseases is coming, and winter is not helping with anything here. So basically, it's a bit better than it was because we pretty much are getting used to the situation, but still need a lot of help from outside, and basically we need money and resources to deal with the situation. It's not only putting pressure on primary care, because that's my part of the cake, but it's putting a lot of pressure on any other parts of the system. And after COVID, we are pretty much the whole system is tired of the full ongoing situation. Yeah.
Now, Poland as a country has been the most generous in terms of number and duration of stay for Ukrainian refugees. The numbers vary at a point. We were made to understand that about 4 million of the 4 million who had left Ukraine at a point, more than 3/4 of them were in Poland. And you and I talked about how they were being housed, Polish families opening their houses and accommodating many of these refugees. But then a number of them had to be housed, albeit temporarily, in these locations, which were more or less like camps, if you like, for want of a better description. Has that situation changed? Because I remember you told me then, too, that those kind of areas could also be grounds for creating problems, particularly health-wise.
The situation is a bit better in that particular part because, some of those Ukrainians actually have money and have enough to find their own flats or locations. The market is difficult because if you add a lot of people that are looking for especially cheaper than more expensive flats, the amount of them is limited. But some of them manage to stand on their own feet, at least in the basic parts. Some of them were housed by the government or local governments. So-called camps are mainly not existing in a way that we understand them. Some of those people are still housed in dorms and that kind of facilities, but let's say nobody is living in a tent or something like that on a break of the winter in that particular part of the world. So the situation is a bit better. We still need a lot of adjustments here, but after 6 or 7 months, you start to, let's say, fit in the society, because it looks that it won't be short-term relation, let's say, but they will stay here for probably years, because even if the conflict will stop within a few months, which I don't see the possibility, but even then, you have years to rebuild whatever was destroyed. I know that a lot of major points of power grids, water plants, and that kind of stuff are destroyed purposefully by Russians just to make the winter more difficult for Ukrainians. So that's a part of the war that is completely not acceptable by any normal country. We are doing that. So we are preparing to let's say keep those people for much longer. And as you said, it's over 3 million Ukrainians in Poland now, which makes it about 10% of our population, which is quite a big number. So at that point, I think we need to start thinking how to actually accept them for very long time.
Indeed, and thinking of accepting them for very long also means that more and more resources will be required, more and more facilities will be required, and more of the time and expertise of people like you will be required. We wish you well and continued strength as you continue to cope with this situation. Thank you very much, Dr. Mikhail Matyacek. Thank you very much.
Take care. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has reiterated Beijing's stance that peace talks should be held to end the war in Ukraine during the G20 summit in Bali. Mr. Xi stressed that China's position on the Ukraine crisis is clear and consistent, advocating a ceasefire, a stop to war, and peace talks. That's according to a readout of a bilateral meeting between the Chinese leader and French President Emmanuel Macron. According to state media, although China has consistently called for an end to hostilities in Ukraine, it has refused to condemn Russia's invasion. Instead, Beijing has called for the legitimate security concerns of all parties to be recognized, while blaming the US and NATO for the conflict. Beijing and Moscow have become close partners in recent years, as both face tensions with the West, with Mr. Xi and Russian President Vladimir Putin declaring the two countries had a no-limits partnership weeks before Russia's invasion began. So far, Beijing has not provided any direct military or financial aid to Moscow that could spark sanctions from Washington. Chinese state media had previously reported on Mr. Xi's support for international peace talks as a mechanism for ending the war. And the United Nations General Assembly has called for Russia to be held accountable for its conduct in Ukraine, voting to approve a resolution recognizing that Russia must be responsible for making reparations to the country. The resolution, supported by 94 of the Assembly's 193 members, that's according to Russia, which invaded its neighbor in February, must bear the illegal consequences of all of its internationally wrongful acts, including making reparations for the injury, including any damage caused by such acts. The resolution recommends that member states, in cooperation with Ukraine, create an international register to record evidence and claims against Russia.
Accounts of atrocities committed by Russians in the occupied territories, murder, rape, torture, forced deportation, looting, they all speak for themselves. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to leave their homes and seek shelter elsewhere. Ukraine will have the daunting task of rebuilding the country and recovering from this war. But that recovery will never be complete without a sense of justice for the victims of the Russian war. It is time to hold Russia accountable. The proposal in front of you today is a proclamation that Russia must be held accountable for its violations of international law in Ukraine. It is reaffirmation of the need of a concrete mechanism for reparations that will breathe life into this proclamation. It is a call for the member states to come together and build legitimate international infrastructure to deal with the consequences of Russian aggression against Ukraine.
It will take a broad international effort to support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction in order to build a safe and prosperous future for the Ukrainian people. But only one country, Russia, is responsible for the damage to Ukraine, and it is absolutely right, as this resolution sets out, that Russia pay for that damage.
U.S. and Russian spy chiefs have met face-to-face to discuss Moscow's nuclear threats in Ukraine and American prisoners held, quote, unjustly by Russia. The discussions between CIA Director William Burns and his counterpart Sergei Naryshkin took place in the Turkish capital, Ankara. The Kremlin said the talks came as, quote, an initiative of the American side. It marks the highest-level public meeting between officials since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The White House said Mr. Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia between 2005 and 2008 and speaks Russian, was not negotiating the end of the war. His message was, quote, on the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons by Russia and the risk of escalation to strategic stability, according to the White House statement. In recent months, the U.S. has repeatedly warned Moscow against using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine amid hints from the Kremlin that it could be willing to do so. In September, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the West of wanting to destroy Russia, stressing he would use, quote, all available means to protect its territory in what was seen as a veiled threat to use nuclear weapons. The European Union and its member states have provided weapons and military equipment worth at least 8 billion euros to Ukraine, and that's according to the bloc's top diplomat. The sum amounts to about 45% of what the United States has supplied to Kiev, according to EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, who told reporters after a meeting with his EU counterparts in Brussels that this was quite meaningful. Russia's war in Ukraine was a major topic of the discussions in Brussels, amid speculations that the West may nudge Kiev to enter negotiations with Moscow. The European Union had also slapped additional sanctions on Iran, targeting 29 individuals in 3 organizations in response to what it has condemned as Tehran's widespread use of force against peaceful protesters.
At least 8 billion of military equipment have already been provided to Ukraine by the European Union and the member states. It's about 45% of the effort done by the US. So it's not negligible. We are talking about not 3.1, but about 8 billion of military support. We will continue isolating Russia internationally. We will continue imposing restrictive measures against Russian economy. We stand ready to continue reinforcing restrictive measures and target third countries' involvement, especially the ones who know that they are providing arms and military support, Iran and Belarus. Putin is unable to conquer Ukraine. Putin is unable to defeat the Ukrainian army. Putin is withdrawing. The Russian army has withdrawn to the other side of the Dnieper River and is trying to compensate this military failure with efforts to increase the human suffering of the Ukrainian people, especially now that the winter is approaching.
Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden had a candid and in-depth exchange of views on issues of strategic importance in China-U.S. relations and on major global and regional issues during their meeting ahead of the Group of 20 summit in Bali, Indonesia. President Biden held a 3-hour talk with his Chinese counterpart, the first in-person encounter since Mr. Biden took office, and an opportunity that both sides appeared to hope would lead to an improvement in rapidly deteriorating relations. Mr. Biden said he was open and candid with Mr. Xi about the range of matters where Beijing and Washington disagree. He cast doubt on an imminent invasion of the self-governing region of Taiwan and seemed hopeful his message about avoiding all-out conflict was received. The U.S. president was frank that he and Mr. Xi came nowhere near resolving the litany of issues that have helped drive the U.S.-China relationship to its lowest point in decades. Mr. Biden entered the talks hoping for an opportunity to take stock with Mr. Xi of the world's most important bilateral relationship. He described Mr. Xi as not overly confrontational, but instead the way he's always been, direct and straightforward. The U.S. president is seen on the sidelines of the Asian summit in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. All of this. Mr. Biden passed promises for the United States to defend Taiwan under a microscope in meetings with Mr. Xi was also taken to task. Let's talk now to Laddie Williams of our business desk, who joins me on the program.
Good morning.
Morning, Laddie. Germany is to nationalize its former Gazprom unit. I mean, some would say, no surprises here.
Yeah.
So, but what's the implication of that, though?
Yeah. So, formerly Gazprom Germania, that was the major distribution unit for the Russian state-owned company. So now they're gonna nationalize the company, even though we know that for a while now, since the war started, the company, all its assets already been taken over already by Germany. So now it's making it official, at this time. And obviously all of this is to secure, gas for the winter and, transforming the company now to SEFE. That's, making sure that there's energy, for Germany going into the winter, and we know how they're trying to protect households and manufacturers from gas prices at this time. It's all a part of this 200 billion euro package that the government has set out to support manufacturers, so that, because we know it's an export-based economy, that's Germany, so they're making sure that these companies get the gas they need and at the right price, because we've seen volatility,
in the prices, with, and because of distribution bottlenecks,
gas prices. So at the end of the day, this move is to make sure that they have all the gas they need, and we know the company has been indebted for a while now, talking about SEFE. So the government has been bailing this company out and looking for ways to support the company to make sure that, because at the end of the day we saw the prices did affect them. They were heavily
impacted by that,
impacted, and that rubbed off on their income. So at the end of the day, we're seeing the government making all of these arrangements, and they're strong moves, and they're quite big moves, and it is expected that they are not they don't lack gas going forward, because we know how that impacts everything the German economy.
Indian exporters are witnessing an increase in the cost of shipping goods to Russia. I mean, India is one of the countries which has taken advantage of this situation maximally to its own benefits.
Enjoying all that cheap oil.
Yeah, but the prices of shipping goods now, the cost of shipping goods, why?
So at the end of the day, when you're trying to move away from the global currency, that's the US dollar for trade settlement, you're bound to have these issues, because now they're looking at allowing rupee settlements for their trade. That's for export to Russia from India, and we're seeing them having issues. The biggest bank there's Sberbank. They're the only ones allowing the rupee trade at this point, and it's risky for them. Not many banks in Russia can actually take on this rupee trade, because they don't really understand it fully. They're still trying to, understand the risk and all of that, because at the end of the day, you just want, your US dollars. So this is the exchange rate and all of that. But now with the rupee trade, they're having exchange rate issues. So Sberbank, taking on all of this risk, is saying, we're going to put a 4% premium on
every trade, and to cover all this miscellaneous costs that are associated with this.
Exactly, and that's adding to the it's making it more expensive for exporters from India to actually get their goods into Russia, because at the end of the day they're trying to get that rupee trade on. So this 4% premium is weighing, and we've seen exports to Russia actually drop since about April, August. Between that period, it's dropped about 24%. So at the end of the day, they're still looking for other mechanisms to get their settlements at this time. But at the end of it, it's trying to move away from the US dollar.
Just before I let you go, I must talk about oil prices because that's the one that concerns us here.
Yeah.
Oil prices extended losses.
Yeah, so it's the same.
Not been a good week for oil.
It's been the same story, ever since prices hit that, all-time high. Been struggling to try and get above $100 per barrel, and it's looking harder now because we're seeing, even though we had investors felt like China were going to reduce some of that, the zero COVID policy, right, bring it down a notch, but they're not doing that at this time because we're seeing COVID cases actually rising. So
right,
the largest importer of oil still having issues. So we're seeing OPEC actually forecasting that, all demand is going to drop, going forward, seeing what's happening in China. Right. So that's already playing into prices at this time. We're seeing it low again. So it's the same old China demand, inflation issues, interest rates, and all of that pushing that market.
All right, then. Thanks, Ladi. Of course, Ladi will have further details of this, as well as the Russian metals issue with the London Metals Exchange. Our viewers can watch out for that on Business Morning and indeed on Business Incorporated. Thank you, Ladi.
Thank you.
Welcome back. We're on the home stretch now, and in the sports news, Andrei Rublev squandered 7 set points early in his meeting with fellow Russian Daniil Medvedev before roaring back to seal a 6-7, 6-3, 7-6 opening victory at the ATP Finals in Turin, Italy. Mr. Rublev said his 6th career meeting with Mr. Medvedev reminded him of his encounter with the world number 5 at the 2020 US Open quarterfinals, where he lost in straight sets, and the 25-year-old was determined to overcome his poor start. But having shaken off the disappointment of squandering several chances to take the opening set, Rublev hit back with 25 winners in the next 2 and held his nerve in the deciding tiebreak to seal the victory on his 5th match point. Rublev said he was cramping towards the end of the contest before winning with a 37-shot rally and match point, after which he dropped to the floor in delight. The match, Rublev signs the camera lens with the words, "Peace, peace, peace is all we need." And finally on the program, a baby born somewhere today will be the world's 8th billionth person, according to a projection by the United Nations. The milestone is an occasion to celebrate diversity and achievements while considering humanity's shared responsibility for the planet, according to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The UN attributes the growth to human development, with people living longer thanks to improvements in public health, nutrition, personal hygiene, and medicine. It's also the result of higher fertility rates, particularly in the world's poorest countries, most of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, including Nigeria, putting their development goals at risk. As the world population hits the 8 billion mark, India is bursting at the seams and is likely to surpass China as the world's most populous country in 2023. $8 billion people, definitely peace being needed so that development can take place. But that's how we wrap up the show this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladia Kiridulale. We're back tomorrow at 9. But watch out for updates on all our stories throughout the day, and especially on the world today at 5 o'clock. Good morning.